two topics for you tonight. I'm going to talk about the comprehensive plan amendments. And thank you for coming out to such a complex and wonky meeting topic. So I'm really impressed that you folks are all here. So just a note on what the comprehensive plan is. The comprehensive plan is a framework for growth over the next 20 years. It coordinates our investments as a city in infrastructure and amenities. It's required under Washington state law. And the Seattle 2035 plan was just adopted last year this time. And that was a major update to the comprehensive plan that happens only once every 7 years. So the Seattle 2035 plan has 4 core values that you can see up there on the screen. The first in the list is race and social equity. And it's also really important to underscore that point at the bottom of the screen there that the Seattle 2035 plan, after a long evaluation, multi-year planning process, it really renewed and strengthened the city's commitment to the urban village strategy. So what is an urban village and what is the urban village strategy? It basically means that the city's long-term plan is prioritizing investments in certain areas, prioritizing investments in our best connections with transit, with transportation options, with amenities like community centers, parks, and libraries. And it also calls for a variety of housing options. So the urban villages are also the places where the city will direct the most growth to over the next 20 years. And as context for our discussion tonight of neighborhood plan policies, recall that the first comprehensive plan under growth management was adopted over 20 years ago in 1994. And that's when those urban villages were first established. Shortly thereafter, neighborhoods around the city got together and created 37 neighborhood plans that all included policies, some of which we'll be discussing tonight. Fast forward over 20 years later, and the Seattle 2035 plan, which was adopted in 2016, again renewed that urban village concept. It carried forward many of the policies in those neighborhood plans, but it also brought in some new ideas that are particularly important, challenging issues that we're facing today. So equitable development, affordable housing are among those. We all know that affordable housing is a real challenge right now. I think many of you are probably feeling that. There are many ways to measure that. These are just a few data points. More than 45,000 of our households pay more than half of their income towards housing. We refer to that as being severely cost burdened. So a lot of folks are really feeling the pinch out there. Average rent for a one-bedroom has increased 35% in the last 5 years. As one of the ways to try to address the affordable housing challenge, the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda was convened in 2014, and in 2015 in the summer, they released a series of 60-plus recommendations to address affordability. That ranged from doubling the housing levy, which voters approved, to strengthening our tenant protections. And one of the key recommendations that we'll talk a bit about tonight is mandatory housing affordability, or MHA. And that is a new program that would require all of the new development you're seeing out in neighborhoods to contribute towards affordable housing. So, the Seattle 2035 plan called for renewing the commitment to urban villages and encouraging housing options in urban villages. And the HALA work encouraged implementing mandatory housing affordability within urban villages. And those are really important foundations for our discussion of neighborhood policies tonight. So why are we talking about the neighborhood plans and those neighborhood plan policies? Well, we need to the city is proposing, and we're proposing to work with neighborhoods to consider some amendments to several of those neighborhood plan policies from that earlier generation of planning during the 1990s. Why do we need to make those amendments? because the comprehensive plan needs to be internally consistent. We shouldn't have neighborhood plans saying one thing and then overarching city policies saying something slightly different.
Why not?
In order to implement mandatory housing affordability, we also need to encourage more housing options, more housing types, particularly multifamily housing within urban villages. It requires a change to the zoning in order to put that affordable housing requirement in place. And we think that this direction is consistent with those 4 core values, leading with race and social equity in the comprehensive plan. So what policies need amendment? The list on the right are 9 urban villages that we think have some policies that may not be consistent with the new policy direction set forward in the Seattle 2035 plan. And we're specifically talking about neighborhood plan policies that call for restricting the types of housing within urban villages, specifically those policies that call for explicitly protecting single-family zoning within urban villages. Really, this is your conversation to have with the city. Many of you worked on those neighborhood plans, and we encourage you to roll up your sleeves and think about the best way that the policies can possibly be amended. We've included some suggestions for you. The first bullet in the list is really kind of the key thing that we need to accomplish, which is kind of remove the direct references to protection of the single-family zoning. Think about the policy intent. Policies really shouldn't be talking about specific zoning designations anyway. And also think about what's specific or unique to your neighborhood as you rework the policy. So just a few ways we wanted to suggest, and this is just a starting point for you all, on how a policy about zoning could pivot. And one of those is that it could focus on the scale or the character instead of the specific zone designation. There are a lot of ways to get additional housing in the neighborhood in a gentle manner that has similar proportions and scale to a single-family zone. Another way the policy could pivot is to think about different locations within the village which may be more or less appropriate for more density. So you might think about allowing for the introduction of more housing closer to the business district where there are more services and supports. You could also think about pivoting the policies to talk about people, the folks that you might want to welcome into your community. So the policy could focus on housing options for certain types of households, such as family-sized households. I heard a number of you mention that tonight. For the comprehensive plan portion of the meeting, we have boards for Morgan Junction, the West Seattle Junction, North Rainier, and Westwood Highland Park, sorry. And so please talk with staff at those stations. There are 4 examples of possible policy adjustments. You can use a green dot or a yellow dot to express a like or a don't like. And there's also a big white space for you all to start suggesting your own ideas. We want to emphasize that this is part of a long process. Just a couple of things. The Seattle 2035 plan process was over a 5-year process before it was adopted in 2016. The HALA recommendations came out in the summer of 2015, and since then we've had almost 3 years now of discussion with communities of MHA. And what we're talking about tonight, those comp plan amendments, would be considered by the City Council, your City Council, who's the ultimate decision maker, and they would consider approving those next summer. So specific next steps for this work are to have these open houses with you. We're taking comments and suggestions through December 8th, so please make sure you get a comment form or go online. Then the city will compile that information and summarize it and send suggestions to the council for their consideration. And I'm going to turn it over to Nick to talk about the second portion of our meeting tonight. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. My name is Nick Welch. I also work for the Office of Planning and Community Development, and I'm here with my colleague, Allie Panucci. I'm going to point her out in the back. She's over there. She works for the City Council's central staff, and she and I are here tonight to get your feedback on a different topic that relates to housing, but to a city proposal related to accessory dwelling units. So first we want to make sure we're all familiar with the terminology that we're using here. Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are small secondary units on a single-family lot. And we define and regulate ADUs in a couple different ways. An attached ADU, often called a mother-in-law unit or a granny flat, is a secondary unit that is either attached or within a single-family house. And a detached ADU, or a DADU, is often called a backyard cottage, and that's a separate structure located in the rear yard of a single-family lot. And both of these, both attached and detached ADUs, are currently allowed in all of our single-family zones today, subject to certain regulations and standards. So as part of the city's work to improve affordability and address our critical housing shortage, one of the things we've been working on is to change some of our existing regulations that affect where someone can build an ADU in order to make it easier for people to create new housing options in single-family neighborhoods. We've been working on this proposal for about the last 2.5 years. Last year, the city's hearing examiner determined that we should conduct a thorough environmental analysis of the proposal. And so we're now beginning that first phase of the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. Over the next year, through the EIS process, we'll do a comprehensive analysis of how that proposal could potentially affect the environment. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to hear your ideas and suggestions for what we should study and consider in that EIS. I'll give a brief summary here of that draft proposal, and then we have a lot more information on the boards in that part of the room back there, and handouts on that table that go into a lot more detail. And Allie and I are here the rest of the night to answer your questions and hear your ideas. The draft proposal would involve 3 main changes. First, we would study allowing some lots to have both an attached ADU and a detached ADU, or a backyard cottage. Currently, under the rules we have in place today, lots can have one of those or the other, but not both. Second, we're proposing to study removing the off-street parking requirement and the owner occupancy requirement that we have in place today. And third, we're proposing to study changing some of the development standards that regulate the size and location of backyard cottages on single-family lots. As I mentioned, we have more information about those specific code changes in the back. Now, we do an environmental impact statement process as a tool for decision makers so that they're informed about the potential impacts of a proposal and so that they can identify ways to avoid or mitigate those impacts. The EIS also gives the public a chance to be involved in identifying and analyzing information related to a proposal. A key step in that process is identifying the alternatives that we will analyze. Alternatives are basically options for achieving the goals of a proposal. And we began that process on October 2nd by starting the scoping phase of the EIS. So during that time, for 30 days, we take public comments about the alternatives and other topics that we should study in the EIS. So that scoping phase goes until November 1st, at which point we will review all the comments we've received and start preparing the draft environmental impact statement, which we expect to publish in the spring. At that point, there will be another public comment period and also a public hearing. And then following that, we will review the draft EIS comments that we receive and respond to them in a final EIS, a final environmental impact statement, which we expect sometime next summer. And then when that EIS process is concluded and complete, the City Council can then start their work of discussing and deliberating on the proposed legislation. So between now and November 1st, we encourage you to give us your input on what we should study. You can do that tonight through comment forms that we have in the back. And the handouts that are back there also tell you several other ways to get in touch with us. We have an email address for the project, and we have an online comment form that makes it easy to give specific feedback about what we should consider. We're eager to hear sort of all range of comments and feedback at this point, but there's there are some specific questions where your feedback is particularly helpful, the ones you see here on the screen. We're really eager to know what alternatives you think we should be studying, what potential impacts to areas of the environment that we should be paying careful attention to, and then ideas you have for how we might avoid or minimize those impacts through different strategies or other actions. Thanks for coming out to participate in both of these topics and help us take a small step forward towards addressing our housing challenge. And lots of city staff are here throughout the room to talk with you the rest of the night. Thanks.